Again, Nathan Mueller, I'm the new extension agronomist, also director for crop variety testing. So that includes corn, soybeans, spring wheat, oats. I've since added sorghum. We have 53 hybrids in the trials this year in central South Dakota, 5 field P locations, 23 varieties. So kind of expanding some other efforts. We do have Kathy Grady who does sunflowers as well, and some of the other oil seeds. So we kind of have 2 groups. I will acknowledge in terms of the trials, we do have quite a bit of participation to help in terms of facilitating that process with the spring wheat breeding crew with Carl Glover and his technician and his group, as well as the winter wheat. Steve Kulsbeck and the winter wheat crew actually does quite a bit of the planting and harvesting East River. Mostly because it overlaps sometimes winter wheat planting with soybean harvest. What I have here, 2 handouts. I'm going to go through the oat one first. I've seen quite a few oats around the state. Last week of June, first week of July, I got 2,100 miles in across the state, and there's a lot of oats in. And I think a lot of people are worried about forage having enough for that, so there's quite a bit of oats, especially down in South Central. But one thing I wanted to highlight, what we have here on the front, at the very top is the new Facebook page. I just started that in February, and if you're not on Facebook, you don't have to be. It's a web page, so you don't have to like it even. You can just go and look at it. There's lots of pictures. It's a way for me to put pictures. So for example, I was at Martin giving a winter wheat variety tour. So what I did, I took a picture of all 36 winter wheat varieties and then put the description similar to what I have for spring wheat here and oats for each one of those. So you can take a virtual tour on the Facebook page if you go there. I uploaded that this week. So stuff like that, progress, what things look like at different locations, updates, when we got stuff planted, when we're going to be harvesting stuff. So it's a way kind of to increase the visibility of the program and follow what's going on. So look for stuff. For example, all the spring wheats that are in the trials here, I actually put that list up in April. So I actually got quite a few people that looked at that, just curious what we planted. Usually we don't know until you see the results or come to a field day. So look there. The other option is going directly to iGrow and finding results and information. I gave the link here for oats. Another way to do it, if you go to the Facebook page, there's this nice little square button that says yield data. If you click on that, it'll bring you to the yield results within iGrow for all the crops, and you can go from there. So another thing we do is we come up with a recommended list of oats and spring wheat and winter wheat varieties for different portions of the state based on our yield trials. We have 9 locations for spring wheat, 6 East River, 9 West River. For example, winter wheat, we have 15 locations across the state. This year, we have less winter wheat locations. We lost some trials, just like farmers lost some fields in winter wheat, especially the central part of the state. So we can use that information along with end use, what the millers think, what other people in the industry input from foundation and crop improvement, come up with a recommended list. What I have here in gray on the front of the oat handout are the 5 recommended oat varieties for this part of the state. Horsepower, Rockford, Shelby, Saurus, Stallion. To let you know how popular the oat breeding program is here, you'll find these varieties planted in a lot of other states, east, south, from here. So a lot of this stuff moves. Growing up in Nebraska, we plant a lot of SDSU released oats down south. A new one I wanted to highlight, as you might be familiar with some of these, is a new one called Goliath that Lawn Hall just released here in 2013. On the back of that handout, page 4, there's a nice long description. Let's see if I can find it. High five. Goliath. I know, Al, how many acres of Goliath do you have?
About 100.
About 100. The nice thing about Goliath is it's tall. So if you're looking for straw, looking for hay and tonnage, if you look at both tonnage and relative feed value, it's number 1 out of the things that's been tested. It's number 2 actually in tonnage, number 2 in relative feed value. So the combination of those two makes it a really good forage, a really good hay. It has really good yield. The problem is, I wouldn't say problem, it's late. It's about 11 days later than Colt, or about 2 days later than Stallion. So it's about 11 days later. So it's late maturing, it's tall, but it's got good disease-resistant package to crown rust, stem rust, barley yellow dwarf, and smut. one thing that Lon always mentions, not to put it under high fertility situations. That's because with a tall oat like this, you just run the risk of it lodging and falling over. So that's something to consider. Other than that, I guess this handout is for you to take home, and if you look at it or not, if it makes it to your kitchen table, great. If not, you won't hurt my feelings. All right, let's switch modes. All right, spring wheat handout. You got lots of paper here. Unfortunately, it does burn well too. So same thing with the recommended list for spring wheat. Number 1 on that list, advanced. There's little Starbite along with Albany, Digger, and Barlow. Those are spring wheat varieties that are susceptible to Fusarium head blight or scab. So if you have 3 fields, for example, you have on your farm Brick, Forefront, and Advance planted this year, Advance would be the one that you probably should be at the top of your list to consider if conditions were right for getting Fusarium head blight to spray. On that list also, when Carl and I were talking about this, acceptable and promising, I might change that terminology because is it acceptable, is it promising, are 2 very different things. And so we'll go over some of these varieties real quick. As quick as I can. The page 2 is a whole bunch of yield data. It's 2012 yield results for East River across those 6 locations. The very first column, for example, Advance yielded 54 bushels across the 6 locations last year. Then there's this nice little percentage or frequency. That's the frequency, for example, if there's 6 locations and it was in the top yield group. And that means that we looked at the data, we can use statistics. We're 90% confident that these group of varieties, let's say 6 out of the 30 are in that top yield group, similar in terms of yield. How frequently did that variety end up in that top yield group? And so if it's 3 out of 6, 50% of the time it was in that top yield group. So anything that, and then you look at that frequency, you might see 100% for 3-year average. That means it was in the top yield group for the state year 1, 2, and 3. So anything that has a high frequency of being in the top yield group means it's stable in terms of yield and productivity, and that's a good place to start off with the list to look at for selecting. This last year, in 2012, the plot average was 46, and you can see the ones in gray there on the far right. Those grayed out cells are spring wheat varieties that were in that top yield group. So even though it says, let's say Barlow says 55 bushels, and right next to it Breaker said 49, that was because we have a certain degree of confidence in the data, experimental error, noise, spatial variability in the field in terms of yield. Those are in the top performing yield group as a whole. And we do the same thing with multiple crops. So Advance, the first one here, it's a little bit shorter variety, usually about 30 inches tall. It's 4 days later than Brick. Has really good yield potential. Again, 2009 in trials that were over 80 bushel, it was in that top leading group in terms of yield. So high yield potential, unfortunately, has some susceptibility to Fusarium head blight, so that's something to consider when you select this and manage it. Another one that's in that same category in terms of yield potential from Lima grain is Albany. Has done really well in terms of yield. The main problem with Albany has been low protein. And so when we talk about Lima grain, we'll have another one that they're kind of trying to complement that with a higher protein spring wheat. Barlow seems to be fairly popular up in this corner of the state. It is on our acceptable or promising list. It is resistant to Fusarium head blight and has a pretty good disease package, or susceptible, to Fusarium head blight, but has, resistant to stripe and stem rust. Good protein. Next one, LCS Breakaway. Again, not as good as yielding as Albany, but higher protein. Breaker is on our recommended list. It's similar in maturity as Advance. Got a very good disease package, resistant to stand spot, bacterial leaf streak similar to Advance, and moderately resistant to Fusarium head blight. So, and it's got good straw strength. So it's recommended for central and eastern South Dakota. It's good spring wheat. Brick It's been around for a little bit longer. It was released in 2008. One thing about this, high test weight. Out of all the varieties we test, it's usually at the upper end of the test weight. And very resistant. Out of all the spring wheats, one of the most resistant to scab. Briggs. Briggs has yielded really well, but the problem's been its inconsistency in terms of its milling quality and baking. And so that's something from the end use side that they haven't really liked, not being able to know what kind of quality they're going to get. So not on the recommended list. Chris, that's an old Czech that's been around for a long time, almost on this. But if you want to know if something lodges, if you have lodging problems, that would be one that would. If you can find it, I think we keep that back. Elgin, newer release from North Dakota, similar maturity to Fowler and also resistant to head blight. Fowler, been a really good spring wheat, especially up in this corner of the state. High yield potential, about 5 days later than Brick, similar to maturity as Fowler as well. Resistant to Fusarium head blight, but susceptible to leaf rust. Next one. Right here, a taller spring wheat, newer release, 2011 from Carl's breeding program. 2 days later than Brick, has really good standability for its height, has good protein and test weight, good end use, very good disease package, resistant to Fusarium head blight. So this is a really strong spring wheat that looks really good. Another one, Linkert. Forefront. Star that. If you have a highlighter, which you don't, highlight it. If I can have favorite spring wheats, that's one of them. So I can have favorites. Thanks, Carl. Linkert. 2013 released brand new from Minnesota. Seed would be available at first with 2014. They mentioned that it has pretty good high protein, good straw strength. Most of the stuff from Minnesota has good straw strength. Another new one, new in the trials. I don't have much information. It's LNR0551 at the top of page 5. It's my cheat sheet. I give it to you. I don't have a lot of information on that, but guess what? We will this very soon here when we have harvest rolling around. Westbred Mayville, like Carl had mentioned, very susceptible to Fusarium head blight along with Samson. So very susceptible. So that's something to mention about that. Next one, Mott. If you're familiar with wheat stem sawfly, they bred this because it has a solid stem, so it's hard to chew through. And so it's not going to lodge and fall over. But if you don't have wheat stem sawfly, don't plant it. It yields very poorly. Okay. Norden right here, released 2012 from Minnesota, another one, similar maturity to Fowler, good test weight, straw strength, moderate resistant to Fusarium head blight, but again new, so we'll see how it does. LCS Power Play right behind me here, from Lima Grain, again newer, 2011, medium maturing, good protein and test weight, not on our recommended list, but we'll see how it continues to do. Prosper. Another North Dakota release 5 days later than Brick, has really high yield potential, similar to Advanced, Traverse, and so that's something to look at. Another one here right next to me to my right, RB07, has done really well. I was talking to Carl, did really well with the heat last year, not so well, but in 9, 10, and 11 did pretty well in the state. So that is on our acceptable promising list. Very good end use, about average protein. Rolig is it does have good resistance to Fusarium head blight and Stagnospora, one of those leaf diseases. If you're familiar with those, tan spot, Septoria, Stagnospora are some of those leaf diseases. So it's got good resistance to Stagnospora. SY Rowan, new entry and going to be released here in 2013, targeted for the northern Great Plains from AgroPro. Sabin, another one, has oxen in its cross, It's got fair to good straw strength, so that's a potential problem with Sabin. Samson, as I mentioned, very susceptible to Fusarium head blight like West Bred Mayville. Another one of my favorites, it happens to be another one from SDSU release that's done really well, specifically not only East River but West River. Done really well across the state. If you look at the frequency of being in that top yield group on that sheet, it's usually, it was 100% of the time. So last year in 2012 at all 6 locations East River, it was in the top yield group. So that's something in terms of select. It has similar maturity to brick, and it yields better than brick. And it also has fairly moderate resistance to Fusarium head blight, so it's really good early maturing spring wheat that yields really well. SY Swarren, another AgriPro release that's very tolerant to Fusarium head blight, and again newer, so we'll see how it does. Obviously a shorter spring wheat variety. Traverse, tall, has yields really well, high yield potential similar to Advance, but the opposite of brick. When we talk about test weight, it's at the other end. It's one of the lowest test weight spring wheats that we have out here. So there's some improvements that you can go with. Select, Forefront, that would be good replacements for Traverse. Oh, Vantage, along with Mott, which was that solid stem variety, which I said don't plant because it's low yield. Vantage has been around for a while. Doesn't have PVP. Stands very well, so it's not going to lodge, but it's not going to yield well either. Velva, another release from North Dakota. Good straw strength but susceptible to Fusarium head blight. West Bred 9879 Clearfield. So this was co-released actually with Montana and West Bred, and they used Coteau in it, which is a solid stem variety similar to Mott. It has the 2-gene resistance for Clearfield, so if you're dealing with cheatgrass or some weedy problems, that is an option. We'll see how it yields. Coming from that area, I'm not sure how well it's going to perform in this corner of the state. One of the last ones here I'll mention, I've been working with Meridian Seed for some other stuff, but they sent me a spring wheat variety. They're going to call it Stingray. It will be released this year, so it's the first time it's been in the trials. Last up, back here we have 2 Minnesota experimentals and 3 from North Dakota. We aren't going to mention those. They don't have a lot of yield data on it, but I'm going to turn it over to Carl to talk about some of the new experimental lines coming out of the breeding program that look really promising and we'll be considering for potential release this fall. 2 in particular, and there's one on my wish list that I'd like to keep, the 4362. So maybe he'll mention that for me.